Welcome to the Freedom Fridays podcast. With me, your host, Pete Clark, the Whispers guy. Work seems to expand to the time that we give it. And I've been investing my time, occasionally on a Friday, to explore how we use our time, our energy, our attention, and the impact it has on our identity. I've been exploring over season 1 some of the mindset shifts in the handcuffs of I have to the freedom of I choose to. And I've shared some conversations, some tips, some tools about how you might want to invest your own time, your own energy, your own attention. How you might want to, if you choose to, make some changes to your identity. How you might have freedom from I have to and design a life around I choose to. If that's of interest to you, then this is the podcast for you. Welcome to the 88th edition, wow, of the Freedom Fridays podcast with a returning guest this week. Please welcome a colleague, a friend, and a brand new author, Glin Bayley. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Pete. Very excited to be here. I love that it's the 88th episode and we're recording this in the month of August, which is also an 8.
Ooh, spooky.
Ooh, yeah, love it.
Spooky. I do believe that 8 is a lucky number is it in Chinese?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know what this is telling us.
I don't know, but I'm excited. So thank you for having me.
Cool. Oh, it's a pleasure. Just for those listening, Glyn and I are kind of colleagues to the same sort of work, but with a different topic. And we probably connected 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, I think 4 now.
Probably, yeah. And I've pretty much done the same thing. Whereas Glyn, you have extended, expanded, taken off into a different universe, and you're now the proud author of a book, which we'll come to. Mm-hmm. But just to give people a little bit of context for contrast, you've now written a book about negotiation.
Yes.
How did you get there?
How did I get to write a book about negotiation? Great question. Well, it started with negotiating with myself, mostly.
Interesting.
I think I've always, as we both are, I think, very deep, reflective thinkers, big questions about life. Where are we heading? What are we doing? My business, when we last spoke, was in the space of executive coaching and self-leadership development. And that is a core part, self-leadership, of negotiation, because emotional regulation, understanding others, recognizing your own trigger points around what gets you out of your logic brain into your emotional limbic brain, all aligns with negotiation and negotiation psychology. So I ended up during COVID working for a negotiation consulting firm. Wonderful experience, great opportunity to train negotiation skills to large enterprises. I worked for the same company that I was trained with back in 2006. So I've been formally trained in negotiation skills that I use for a long time in my career. But what was interesting was going back into a role in a consulting firm after being in my own business, executive coaching, made me realize that negotiation was more than just about business. And it actually had much more alignment with the work that I was already doing in self-leadership. Because for me, what I've learned is negotiation isn't just about what you do in a process. It actually is a huge part of defining and determining who you can become through the process. And in spending time lots of reflection time, thinking about where the overlap between my previous work and the work that I was doing with corporates, what I saw was that there was a real gap in how people were communicating about negotiation and what it was as a tool and a skill set. And I'd never really heard anyone else talk about negotiation becoming a catalyst for, I guess, stepping into your truest expression of yourself and becoming more of who you want to be. And so in pondering that, I ended up leaving the corporate consulting role that I was in, started my own business called the Value Negotiator. And then that led me to question, how was I going to leave a mark that was different to everything I'd read about negotiation from a skills perspective, and bring some different thinking to it. So I wrote a book, not knowing at the time the publisher was going to change the book name to be called the Negotiation Playbook, which is a great name and I love. But it had started with a much deeper sort of self-identity piece. And the original name I was pondering and playing with was the question almost being posed, which was, why not you? You know, so because we always have this self negotiation with ourselves when we're embarking on a new life choice or a career choice or a dream that we want to fulfill. And lots of the mental dialogue I've certainly had over the years is that pesky and internal voice that gets in the way and starts having a conversation with you about all the reasons why you can't. And so I wanted to have that question posed, well, why not you? To go from a question, why not you, to a statement of like, why not you? And the journey that we go through in negotiation to get to that outcome of like, of course, why not me? Why can't I have what it is that I'm wanting? And who would I need to become to be able to access that? And what I believe is negotiation as a tool, as a skill set, gives you the capacity to dive deeper into more practical ways to not only negotiate with yourself more effectively, because you can start to see what is your ego voice and your sort of emotional, scared part of your brain, and the logic and the rational side of you. And it helps you create the space between a stimulus and a response. And in that space is often the answer. And it also then gives you the skills to put into practice influencing and persuasion, which is part of taking other people on the journey towards getting what you want. So long answer, but yeah, I think the too long didn't listen summary is I spent a lot of time thinking about what motivated and drove me, and then connected the dots between a core business skill and human EQ development, and thought, right, there's some clear alignment here where you can use it for a practical business skill and a life skill. But I want it to be a tool for actually developing you as your best version of yourself, and an identity evolution skill.
Interesting. Well, you can probably guess I'm definitely going to dive into the negotiating self concept. But first, you've got a copy. Show us a copy of it. Show us a copy of the Negotiation Playbook.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, I feel a little bit jealous that you've got your name on a book. Nice to come at some point. So for those that are listening who, probably a bit like me, who might have heard of the Harvard Negotiation Project.
Mhm.
They might have heard of a concept called win-win.
Mhm.
How is this different to how we typically go about or understand negotiation?
Uh, it advocates for collaborative negotiation over competitive negotiation.
Mhm.
It advocates for creation of value rather than destruction of value, which win-win would absolutely stand for. I think the key distinction is where I'm aiming to drive the conversation is that it's not about just win-win, that it's actually win together. Because the top right quadrant, often ends up being win-win. And I want it to be win together, but together can
What's the
only
difference?
really, it forces us to think about who we're being in the process. Because you can create a win-win for people, and still to some degree be transactional in the process.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And what I'm wanting to shift the dialogue is, rather than just being transactional, if we were relational with each other, then actually we could win together, but the opportunity to create value is significantly more, because it becomes a different conversation when we're saying we're in something together to drive an outcome
Yeah.
versus what do you want, what do I want, and making a transactional
Mhm.
exchange. The other
Kind of,
part of that is the identity piece, which is the core distinction. I'm anchoring on the perspective, I want you to question, who are you being through the process of negotiation? Now, negotiation has been associated with methods that could be perceived as being quite manipulative, and some people have the word
we'll
manipulation in a
get there.
negative
We'll get there.
connotation, and some would say manipulation is in a positive connotation, depending on what angle you're looking at it from. And what I'm wanting to sort of, I guess, flush up the conversation around is ethical negotiation doesn't happen because someone is told there's rules they have to follow to be ethical. It comes from your association with the identity of who you are. Do I see myself as someone who is morally driven? Do I see myself as someone who would promote ethics because that's the identity that I would associate myself with? So, i.e., me anchoring into the identity of the person I want to become or am being, and then working back from that to my negotiation approach, it's going to influence my negotiation approach. Because if I'm only anchored on the result, independent of who am I being in pursuit of the result, I could get the result many different ways, but there's only one way that's going to keep me feeling integrous with myself, and that's understanding my value system, understanding who I want to become through the process and what I stand for. And so I think when I look at negotiation, like, yes, Harvard exists and it's amazing. Yes, there's various different schools of negotiation, and we talk about collaboration and we talk about competition, and each has its place. But I think if we're truly to change the way the world creates value in the agreements that we make, we have to work from an identity basis. And I just don't see enough people developing the EQ required to even understand what that even means for who they need to be and how they show up.
Okay. I'm going to present a bit of a skeptical case here, if that's okay.
Please, yeah, go ahead.
And it's partly personal, but I'm not going to make it personal. I reckon many of us would think of negotiation in terms of buying and selling, right? The transaction of goods and services, etc., etc. And if we accept the two biggest purchases we probably make in our lifetime, a house or a car,
Yep.
if I get real practical for a second, and I've experienced both this year, I get where who I'm being has an impact on the buyer or the seller because of the influencing part. But you know what? If I can get $1,000 off the price of that car, I don't care how I'm being. How would you respond? And I know it's a thin slice. It's a really thin slice of a much broader context around negotiation, which we'll get to. But how would you answer someone that says, all right, I'll just get into a good state. That state will influence the seller. And in fact, $1,000 off, I don't care who I'm becoming. I've just saved $1,000. How would you
Yeah.
respond to that skepticism?
So I think there's two distinctions there. You can separate the who you're being for a moment and go, what's the context, right? So the context is, say I'm buying a house. Who I'm being is still going to act with integrity and ethics if I'm choosing that identity, right? But my objective is still to get the best deal available to me, right? So the way I'm looking at that is to discern based on the context in that specific situation alone, because there's so many different contexts in which negotiation is, but let's say house buying or car buying for the two that you've mentioned, house buying. We often think, so if I was to give an example around an auction, we think the people we're negotiating with are the other people in the auction, like because they can influence the sale price based on what they're bidding, right? Yeah. And so they're key players in that negotiation. However, the real negotiation is happening with the auctioneer and the vendor's real estate agents, because they ultimately are standing to gain personally and professionally from the deal that's done, right? So in that environment, you are in a competitive negotiation context. Right. So whilst I say win together is the approach I take in the way I communicate with them. So I can be assertive and I can be direct and I can be uncompromising, but that doesn't need to mean that I'm being rude, aggressive, and disrespectful, right? So I can still focus on the outcome that I want, which is to be really mindful of the fact that I'm going to have whispers in my ear from the sales agents putting undue pressure on me at the time, perceive me to be losing out against the peer group that might be in the room.
Yep.
And I've got to go in there with clarity around. So what am I aware of around this context? Who stands to gain? Who am I actually negotiating with? What are my parameters? And what am I willing to do in terms of protecting myself from being exploited, right? And that does mean, hey, well, I'm not going to reveal the full amount of my budget because it would be inappropriate for me to do so. It does mean having a clear plan of how I'm going to bid and in what increments, so that I can make sure that my plan is made when I'm in a logical, rational, considered state. So when I'm in the emotional high of the auction, I'm not led astray from the plan that I've created. And so I think, and that's the thing, people often think of negotiation just based on context of buying and selling. But if I shift the context to you're negotiating with your partner around who's making dinner, or you're negotiating with the kids around what chores they've committed to do, or we're negotiating with our friends around which location to meet for a coffee, depending on where we both live and what's convenient. Like, we're negotiating all the time. Yeah. So depending on where you are in the context is going to change. The strategy that needs to be applied needs to change as appropriate, but who you're being and the identity that you're choosing to step into still needs to be rooted in the awareness of the values you're going to bring to the table. And I think that's the anchor that I'm trying to land with this, is that unless you have clarity around the values that are needed for successful negotiation, then it's easy to become unanchored, so to speak, and behave in ways that are actually counter to who you actually want to be in the pursuit of an outcome that you can still achieve by being a better human in the process.
Oh, maybe 5 years ago, I think. So on the sell side,
Yeah.
I sold one of our family cars
Yeah.
To a young kid,
Mhm.
I don't know, mid-20s, late 20s, and we agreed the price. The price is irrelevant. And just as he was about to sign, I said, and you can take $500 off that on the condition that you pay it forward to someone else at some point in the future.
Love
Now,
that.
I've never done that before. I've never done it since. Interesting. But I watched the change in state that he had. I watched the change in state that I had. I watched the change in state for everyone that I've told that story to. And so look, it cost me $500, but what I gained was priceless.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not telling the story to kind of go, hey, look at me, how good am I? But just to serve as an example, I think, from you around who you are being and stepping into an identity, the impact that can have can go way, way beyond the transaction.
Absolutely. And it speaks to what was more valuable to you in that exchange. Like you valued more the opportunity for him to have a head start in, getting what may or may not have been his first car, an excited, big purchase for someone of a young age. And the opportunity to learn that actually there is good people in the world and there is humanness in the process of buying and selling. And we can pay that gift forward. Like, it doesn't have to be just trying to exploit each other. Like, it really doesn't. But unless we know what we truly value, we won't question whether the exchanges we're making are appropriate. And like, there's certain things that I will choose to negotiate, and there's certain things that I won't, because my time, my resources, my energy is more valuable than, bartering over a $20 reduction in a shop, So I'm like, I'm okay with paying full price for things that I don't deem to be, as valuable for my time and energy to put into having a dialogue around getting a price reduction, because it's not about price being the value in that particular context.
Yeah, that's a much more extensive and greater realm of what negotiation is. And I totally agree. We're negotiating everything all day with everyone. We wouldn't see it as a trade necessarily, but those examples that you talked about, where did we go for coffee, getting the kids to clean the bedroom, yada yada, all of those things are attempts at trading one thing from another.
Yeah. And I think the key distinction I make for that is the intention with which we approach that communication is what makes it a negotiation versus just a regular conversation.
Yeah, sure.
Like, if I'm being intentional about understanding what's important to the other person, if I'm being intentional about understanding what's important to me, then I can get curious, I can get creative, I can focus on the connection I'm building, and I can exchange the value that I can exchange, being mindful of what the exchange means to the other party too.
A couple of things spring to mind there. Again, we can put it into a context to make it maybe easier, whether it's buying a car or buying a house. Three things come to mind. Do you have a sense that people really know what's important to them? Do you have a sense of, if they do know, are they willing to reveal it? And if they do reveal it, then do they fully trust the other party, given we're humans, and humans are great at being humans, and we're predictable. do you think they trust the other human not to use it to their advantage?
Short answer is no to the first one. What was the second? I remember the last question. What was the second
Do you think
question?
people really know what's most important? No.
No, yeah.
Do you think if they knew they'd be willing to reveal it?
No,
No. And do you think they trust the other
no,
person? No.
no.
As I thought.
Yeah. But if we are skilled in negotiation, then we do get intentional about spending the time we need to understand what's truly valuable to us. With that intention and with those skills developed, we are more readily able to discern when is the most appropriate time to reveal information and in what context. With that discernment and context in place, then it allows us to make an assessment of the risk and the appropriate strategy that needs to be applied to determine whether that person can be trusted. But if I know enough about negotiation, before I even engage in the conversation, I've already, in my planning stages, made those assessments intentionally and with clarity around what is the situation, what relationship do I have with the other party? What do I know about them already? That could give me data points that point to whether or not this person is trustworthy or not. And I might test that with bits of information that I give that could be perceived as high value to the other party, but actually are low risk bits of information to share. But I think when people don't have the skills, the default becomes, I'm going to put my guard up. I'm going to feel like everyone's out to get me. And therefore, I'm going to play my cards close to my chest. And we're in this argy-bargy of negotiating without actually giving information. And the only thing that we can do in that context is distribute value between one person to the other person, and we very rarely get to the opportunity to create value. Creating value requires trust. It requires openness. It requires information giving and receiving. But you'll never get to that unless you can understand that that's even available as a possibility.
Yeah, I sense that at least on one side of the exchange, there needs to be an intention that 1 + 1 equals more than 2. Something neither of us have thought about yet.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Do you have a best unlock question to get a little bit closer to what someone thinks is most important for them, apart from what's most important for you?
Yeah, I think the best way often to get information, and this again requires an assessment of the risk, and it's obviously contextual, right? So it's hard for me to be super generic, but contextually, what I would say is the best way to get information is often to share information first, because if you've given something, you invoke the law of reciprocity, and people therefore want to give you something in return, albeit subconsciously. They may not consciously know that that's what they're doing, but that's what happens. So if I was to share with you, here's my situation. One of the things that is of importance to me in this deal is the location of the property that I choose to buy being close to the schools that my children are going to go to, right? So in that context, I might give that information, which doesn't harm me to say, because it's true and it is going to determine the catchment area, but might be valuable for the other party to receive, to go, okay, well, the vendor's only available to, well, it's a bad example, a house, because often it's the agent. But if you to then have the dialogue with the agent around, well, what's important to the vendor in determining who he sells or who she sells to. And again, you've got, if there's a third party in the middle, you have to discern how much you can trust that other party. But often, again, with the intention, people want to help people they like. So another law is around the liking principle.
Yeah.
And if you become a likable character and
Yep.
person, which, I would say most of us, when we're being the best version of ourselves, are,
Mm.
then you've got that reciprocity piece and the likability factor. And they're both influencing principles that
Yeah.
drive the other party to give you more. And when
And
you're aware of what those influencing principles are, if you keep stacking and layering those,
yeah.
you get further clarity around how to effectively persuade and influence without undermining your position.
Last question about going down the kind of house and car route, because that's probably
Yeah.
too binary for the moment. But I'm
Yeah.
interested. Have you any experience where someone on the sell side has taken a lower number based on likability and reciprocity?
People have taken a lower number based on understanding when you've understood their context. So,
Right.
for example, I would say, and I'll give you a personal example. So, when I moved to the Sunshine Coast, before purchasing where we live now, we rented, and because we didn't know where we wanted to be or what location was best. And we were looking for properties online from Sydney, through the websites, and we found one. We'd booked an online viewing with the agent, where she was just walking around the property on FaceTime essentially. And through that, we were able to gather some information around, obviously the condition of the property, where it was, why the owners, the current tenants were leaving, and therefore what the desires of the owners were, briefly around finding the right tenants. In that, what the advertised price was significantly higher than what we actually ended up getting it for. And at the time, the market was, if you were to believe everything that the news was communicating, was that the vacancy rates were less than 0.1% in this particular area. It was highly desirable. Everything that would have conditioned us to otherwise go, if it's our perfect house to rent for now, let's not bother negotiating, because there's too many factors that would work against us. But one of the things that we did was to ask the question, how many people have already submitted an application? And the answer we received was 4. And I said, okay, well, that's really promising. And often agents will use that as a scarcity mechanism to go, oh gosh, there's 4, so
Right.
if you want to get in now. But what I thought was, well, if they've had 4 applications, something's not quite right in that they haven't automatically taken this off the market and they're still taking applications.
Mm-hmm.
So it told me price wasn't important, because I couldn't imagine a situation where 4 people had put in applications at less than the value of the rental.
Interesting.
I didn't know what the actual reason was, but I could make an educated guess to go, there's no way 4 people in the context of the current situation are going to offer less. So something else is more important to them. And my assumption was, because of the size of the house, the location, they wanted a discerning couple, family, to maintain
Right.
the quality of the property.
Right.
And we were, a couple with no kids, and it was a ridiculously sized 5-bedroom house that we would not even need, but it would mean that we weren't going to be drawing with crayons on the walls whilst
Yeah.
we've got young ones running around.
Yeah, that
So I
makes sense.
made an educated guess. I wasn't certain, but I'm like, this is about quality, not price.
Mhm.
And so we positioned ourselves, got references, even got references for my toy cavoodle about his behavior and his training, and photos to highlight how beautiful he was.
Yeah.
And we offered $200 a week less than what it was being put on the market for. And so not an insignificant sum,
And you got
but
it.
we got it. We got it.
Interesting. That's a
So,
great
but
example.
it's the intention of,
Yeah.
am I asking enough questions around it? And am I joining the dots and testing a hypothesis? Like with negotiation, as with anything in life, we don't always have the exact information we need, but we have to be willing to test a hypothesis and learn from that. And it becomes a lot easier to do when you've got a structured framework to
Yeah.
follow in a process that allows you to get the data you need and go, okay, this is where my process needs to be amended. But when you're just blankly shooting from the hip and making it up as you go, then, you know, having a hypothesis is great, but you don't know why it worked. You don't know, you know, what you need to change to make that formula work for you again next time, all of that kind of information. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good example. A really good example of where your intention, your thoughtfulness, the incomplete data was giving you something
Yeah.
that you could play into. No, I get that. Um, I'm assuming in your world you've come across this.
I have, yeah. It's a book I highly recommend.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I've been blown away by some of it.
Yeah.
And in the most extreme of negotiation circumstances.
Yeah. Crisis, hostage negotiations,
Yeah,
absolutely.
extreme,
Yeah.
extreme. It's thoroughly recommended. But what for me is the great thing about it is partly the processes, but just even the questions.
Mm-hmm.
I think just the questions help. Even if you ask them as a question or make a statement, it reveals something about you
Yeah.
that if you're paying attention, not just to the answer, but how they answer, it
Correct.
can help you with some incomplete data again.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And we think we ask questions effectively, and then we realize that there's just next level opportunities to improve our questioning. But it brings a key point. We often are so in our heads,
Yeah.
we're thinking about what we need to say more than we spend time thinking about how we need to listen and for what information we need to listen out for or look out for or feel out for, depending on which of your senses is absorbing that context. Because sometimes our spidey sense is an internal gut response that we have to feel for. It's not something we see or hear. So we have to understand all of that. And unless we're taking time to pause, to create silence in the dialogue, we're not going to hear a lot of what we need to hear or see what we need to see.
Yeah. Right at the start, Glyn, you mentioned around negotiating with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most of us would assume that in a negotiation, there are at least two parties. Otherwise, it's not a negotiation, right?
Yeah.
It's an whatever. It's a monologue. So if we're negotiating with ourselves, that means there's two parties involved.
Mm-hmm.
Please explain. How can there be two me's? How can there be two Glins? What are you talking about?
Well, I'm talking about our emotional ego. So we have what I call the Joker, which is the wild card that comes out to play. Sometimes that wild card ego serves us and is in our favor. Other times that wild card works against us. And it depends on what context we're in to determine whether it's a positive card or a negative
So
card
you don't
sometimes.
literally mean someone joking around,
No,
right?
no.
Okay,
I mean, sort of the Joker in the context of you don't know what you're going to get.
right.
You know,
Oh,
yeah. So is it positive? Is it negative? And so I refer to sort of the alternative way to see it, and it's another book I would highly recommend, is by Professor Steve Peters, and
Yeah.
it's called The Chimp Paradox.
Yeah.
So he refers to our monkey mind as the chimp, right? So I call it the wild card, the joker in us. He calls it the chimp. I love both. The chimp's more probably commonly understood.
Yeah.
On the opposite side, and I guess the reason why I called it the joker and called it the wild card is what I call is the ace. And the ace is your authentic conscious expression. Your ace is the witness, the observer in you. And the way I discern between the two, and if you think about to you being age 3 and then age 10 or age 18, age 29, or whatever age, as we progress through our years, when we reflect back, there's a part of us that hasn't aged. There's a part of us where there's this inner sense of ourselves, a voice perhaps, or the observer that's been watching us at that age, at each age, that stayed exactly the same, even though we were 3, even though we were 10, even though we were, 18. And so the authentic conscious expression is the witness that observes what our personality, our ego can do. And it's the one that's keeping us grounded to, okay, the ego can serve us or harm us, but it's the witness, it's the observer, it's the, as you call them, the whispers. It's not a loud voice, but it's a steady, calm, peaceful voice, perhaps, that you might hear, or it's a sense of knowing that you might have that allows you to step back from the situation and zoom out and see you in action and determine whether your behavior is appropriate or not. And we can't do that when we're in our ego. We can't do that when we're in the chimp part of our brain. We can't, or the joker. We're too much in the situation rather than above the situation to be able to look at it. And so when I think about the two parts of us that are negotiating, when I observe delegates in workshops, participating in a negotiation training exercise where they've got a case study that they're working on and they're in negotiation, and then we come back and we do a debrief, and I ask them, so who are you negotiating with? And often I hear back, oh, it felt like I was negotiating with myself, because they've got another party in the room, which is your point, right? We're negotiating with another party. For a negotiation to happen, there's 2 people. But for many of them, there was 3 people in what they were aware of. It was like me and myself, and then the other party. And by default, if you've got you and yourself, then they must have them and their selves. So actually, in every negotiation where there's 2 physical bodies, there's actually 4 negotiators at the table. And it's either your truest, calmest expression when you're in your logical, rational mind, or your ego when your chimp is out to play, and or the joker's come out the deck and it's been thrown down and you're like, oh, was that a good move to play the joker card or not? But yeah, we want to keep the joker in the deck, we want to keep the chimp in the cage, whichever metaphor is best sort of used for it. The ultimate objective is to allow the witness to be the one that's reading the situation, because you're not in your emotional brain at that time. You can look at it logically for what the situation is.
Glyn, I'm assuming, are you familiar with the principles of nonviolent communication?
Not as directly as that, no.
Because Marshall Rosenberg, who was the author, passed away a few years ago. And it's a really sensitive thing to say given world events. way back in, I think, I'm going to guess the 80s, I think, maybe before then or after then. He managed to set up a Palestinian and Israeli parents group. The entry ticket was that the other side had killed your children.
Mm.
So that born out of, can there be any more sensitive, any more incredibly emotional scenario for two groups to come together in 1 + 1 = more than 2?
Yeah.
And he talks about, I can't remember the other animal that he uses, but one of the animals that he uses in terms of those 4 people
Yeah.
is a giraffe.
Mm.
It's partly giraffes have the biggest hearts of any mammal.
Love that. Did not know
Right? So
that.
it's interesting about, he actually uses giraffe and I've forgotten the other animal,
Yeah.
puppets,
Yeah.
to find out which one is talking
Yeah.
when we're having this communication around a
Love it.
conversation. And it's essentially negotiation.
Yeah, for sure.
It's essentially
Yeah.
negotiation. And I'm, even thinking about this conversation, I reckon there's so many more situations that we're negotiating in than people would ever fully understand, accept, and even recognize.
Absolutely. And that is absolutely a prime example of a really sensitive situation.
Mm.
But when you look at what's happening in the world right now, all evidence points to a lack of negotiation capability
Right.
in our most influential, most powerful political leaders,
Mm.
because we're at war with each other.
Yeah.
And war is essentially a competitive negotiation, where the only thing that's going to happen is one party is going to lose and the other party might get a perceived win, but there's going to be potentially significant destruction
Yeah.
in the process of getting that outcome.
Yeah.
It's focused on transaction in the way we interact with each other rather than relationship. There's
Yeah.
no relationship being considered at all. And you can see how, and I love someone, and I'm sure there is probably one of the crisis or mediation negotiators that are in those, UN
Like the hope
negotiations.
so, eh?
Yeah, for sure there will be
They will be.
having to deal with people's chimps or their potential drafts
Mm.
and coordinate the zoo, so to speak, right? And make people really aware of from what context are they talking? Because if they're in their ego is about self,
Yeah.
right? Our authentic conscious expression as humans is about us as part of a community together. Like there is no them and us, it's just us, it's we.
Mm.
And I don't think there is enough application of negotiation skills, because I think if we were taught negotiation skills in schools, collaborative negotiation skills and capabilities in schools, we would, in one generation alone, transform what adults are doing at adult to adult communication level.
Yeah.
Because negotiation creates more compassion,
Yeah.
because we have to have empathy in the way we're listening and seeking to understand each other, and a desire to then turn that empathy into action, to make change. We've got to be curious, we've got to be creative to find solutions that aren't currently visible to us and require a level of trust to allow us to explore where those options could be. We've got to truly connect with each other. So there's so many principles that negotiation as a skill set contributes to the bettering of the world, which is why I think it ultimately comes down to who we're being. Because if we are being in our egos, we aren't going to develop the emotional intelligence skills that are required to separate our truest self, the giraffe, I love that, or our authentic
And
conscious
I
expression
think
is.
it was, I think it was I think it was a chimpanzee, a
Yeah,
monkey is the
yeah, your
perfect
monkey
perfect
mind and your giraffe, or the
monkey
joker and
mind.
the wild card and the,
That would
the
make
joker
sense.
card or the ace,
Yeah.
whichever metaphor works and resonates. It's important to find different language that resonates for people. So
Yeah.
I'm really not precious about just anchoring to language I've created, but what resonates for people, so it makes it meaningful.
Mm.
And I think if you can make sense of it, then that awareness creates a change in your thoughts, and your thoughts then change your actions, right? And I think that's what we want to try shift through this. And that's certainly my hope when I think about some of the stuff that I've covered in the negotiation playbook. I talk to the use of compassionate power, and people go, well, what do you mean compassionate power? But I was like, power is always in traditional negotiation contexts seen as power over someone to get
Mhm.
a better outcome through potentially a use of force, because my size of my organization versus your size means that I've got more power, and therefore I've got more leverage, and therefore I could wield a greater sort of weapon over you if I needed to. We can weaponize power. And what I advocate for is, well, if I take the retail and supplier examples, often in commercial negotiations over the years, being in fast moving consumer goods, I have seen multiple examples of suppliers threatening to withdraw supply and take stock off the shelves, or retailers threatening to withdraw space and remove distribution from suppliers. All of that is a lack of negotiation skills, because you're using power over each other to
Yeah.
force an outcome that we want, rather than compassionate power, which is how can we ethically influence and persuade someone without resorting to force to get them to do something that creates value for us and them.
Yeah.
And it's because they're not looking to create value for each other. It's they're in their egos, they're in their chimp minds.
Yeah.
Me. What do I get?
Yeah.
And you're not doing what I want you to do, so I'm going to punish you. And we cannot be in the world of punishing others because they don't do what we want them to do. We've got to be in the world of understanding others,
Mm.
because if you're in the world of understanding others, you'll understand how complex people are, because we ourselves are really complex human beings. And we can create more empathy for the myriad of emotions and internal dialogues that we have before we even get into the exchange that we have outside of ourselves.
Yeah. Um, what came first? The negotiation playbook and the negotiating with yourself? Or did you negotiate with yourself and that led to the negotiation playbook?
It's the chicken and the egg question, isn't it? Honestly, I don't know. I feel like I was guided by a need to write another book. Um, I didn't know what that book needed to be, but all I knew at the time was there was something that I needed to express.
Yeah.
And through support from family, friends, and then a mentor on a book retreat that I booked into, I was able to flush out the ideas and have that external party help me navigate sort of the internal negotiation that was going on with me.
So probably a kind of DNA helix, they're all kind of working together.
Absolutely. I love that visual. Yeah.
Interesting.
Mm.
What do you think is misunderstood about negotiation?
I think what's most misunderstood is people think it's a specialist skill for specialist contexts, and it's not. It's a life skill for everyday contexts.
Okay.
like for better relationships at home with your loved ones, better relationships with your friends and your family, a better relationship with yourself, because you can be more compassionate with the mental dialogue that you're having if you can start to witness it and separate your thoughts, because you're creating the discipline to pause, which we need to.
I'm going to be a little bit unfair on you.
Oh, feel free. Go ahead.
Because I think many people listening would find it really useful, even just an off the cuff answer, which I know there's more to it than this when you see the question, but I guarantee there will be. For example, how do I negotiate a better salary?
Yeah. You want to organize the how?
Yeah. I mean, have you got top 3 tips to negotiate a better salary?
Yeah, I'll give you a method, which I talk
Right.
through in the book. So
Right.
first thing is identify your value. And if you focus on value, you've got to recognize that it's not your intrinsic value or your personal worth that's on the table for negotiation.
Yeah.
It's extrinsic value. So your intrinsic value never changes, but your extrinsic value absolutely will, because it's determined.
The value it brings the organization, the customers, etc., etc.
Yeah, market value. So extrinsic value is determined by the benefit or usefulness of what you offer to the other party.
Yeah.
But we often conflate our intrinsic value of my skill set, my value, me.
Yeah.
And we don't recognize that me and my personal worth is never on the table for negotiation, ever.
Interesting.
It's only extrinsic value,
Correct.
usefulness and benefit to the other party. So step 1, identify your value. Step 2, analyze the data. And there's only 2 forms of data you need to analyze. It's people data, because people give you information, and understanding the context of who you're negotiating with and what they perceive about the situation, what their needs are, is important, and their interests. And then there's published information and data. So more objective information about what you can go for or what you can't go for, which contextualizes what is credible, whilst also understanding the context with which you're in with the person. So analyze the data, 2 sources, people and published. And for that, the reason being is data not only gives you information, which gives you power, data gives you information, which also, more importantly, gives you confidence. Because when you've got confidence, you're more likely then to take the next step.
Yeah.
The next step is understanding, in the methodologies, understand your leverage. Part of that's understanding, once you've got the data, is, well, what have you got that the other party wants and is valuable to them? So what are the key levers that you can exchange in the negotiation that enables you to determine whether or not you are in a position of power, more or less than the other party that you're negotiating with, right? 4th step is embrace feeling uncomfortable. Because your opportunity to maximize the value you exchange sits outside of your comfort zone. Because if it's comfortable, you're not maximizing what's potentially available. You're only stopping yourself based on what you feel you can justify, or your logic brain's kicking in and going, oh, I only have this bit of information, but I don't know what they think. And, I'm not testing my hypothesis. So I'll just ask for a small amount, and I won't seek to see where there might be value. So back to your earlier question around, there may be situations where your employer is willing to give you a lot more than the market rate because it's contextual. But if you don't understand that data, you're never going to ask for more than what's comfortable, because what's comfortable is market rate. And it's easy to have the conversation that I'm being underpaid versus my market rate, and here's my data. But asking for more feels uncomfortable, and we need to embrace that. The other reason why we need to embrace feeling uncomfortable is we're going to get data from other people when they are uncomfortable in the negotiation. And we're also going to be giving data through our discomfort. Often what happens is we are loose with our language. So we use language like, I'm looking for, I probably need about, roundabout here would be great. And we're not precise and concise with our language. So our discomfort leaks value, right? Our loose language leaks value. So we need to embrace that feeling of discomfort more regularly so that we're not exposed through our body's natural response to discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
And then the final step in the methodology is execute the plan. But it presupposes there is a plan.
Yeah.
And most people want to wing it. And I would say you cannot maximize value in a deal, in a negotiation, whether it's for your salary or whether it's for a business deal or whether it's for a house purchase, unless you have a plan. And the plan ultimately involves thinking about what do you need to do before the negotiation that sets the scene so that you are best placed and priming the context, the other party, the positioning of where your value is. So have you increased the perception of your value long before you get to the negotiating table with your boss?
Mm-hmm.
Are you clear on how you're going to do the actual exchange of information in the conversation with them?
Mm-hmm.
And do you know what needs to happen after you've had the exchange? Because there's lots of value that's lost when people don't implement what they thought was agreed, and it's because people don't get things in writing, people don't agree when the pay rise is going to come through, and then waiting another 10 months before the actual salary review date and when everyone else is getting paid for the money to come through, right? So there's lots of stages in the negotiation before, during, and after that you need to be aware of and plan, and you can't even give that time or energy unless you consider that there's a need for a plan in the first place.
Glyn, that's possibly the most comprehensive answer I've ever had to an unfair question.
Yay! As I said,
So,
it requires thought, doesn't it?
here's another one.
Negotiation.
Here's another one, right? Because that sounds, I mean, that's extremely comprehensive. And before we finish, I'm going to make sure people know how to get the book, how to get a hold of you, because that sounds like, salary is one thing, but there must be huge benefit in you working with people to do huge commercial contracts that, one loose lip could probably save thousands of dollars. But here's a more unfair question then.
Go on.
How do I negotiate with my teenage kids to either clean the bedroom, do the dishes, or get off the screen? Or even all three?
The same methodology. Have
But
you not only so if you were to go identify your value, so your value is, a clean, tidy house, present children, conversation around the dinner table or whatever it might be, but you've also then got to do the what do they value, right? Because unless you understand what they value, you've got no insight into what the exchange will need to look like. So that's one thing. In the executing the plan piece, if I jump to that part, you've got to make the exchange conditional. And this is where people don't make the exchange conditional. So you might offer a valuable exchange, but you offer it without a commitment to what you need them to do. So it's we call it if you then we, if you do this then I will do this. Another framing that I've heard which I really like, it's if cabbage then ice cream. Eat your greens and then you get your desserts. So you've always got to frame what you want them to do first. What's the payment that's needed? What's the activity that's needed before the reward? Because if you don't put what you need done, say for example, screens off, and then make then I can do this for you, they won't be able to contextualize the value of what they're doing. So if I use an example, if they were younger kids, we might say to them, I'll read you a story if you go to bed and brush your teeth and put your pajamas on. But because you've put story first, your child just hears story, 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 story. Whereas if you say, if you put your pajamas on and brush your teeth, then I will read you a story, which frames the cost involved to get the story. So you have to frame it that way. And what I would say is in the pre-priming stage, so that, you know, they execute the plan phase, but really early on, is think about how you can prime and position the perception of the value you're exchanging with them long before you're at the point you're actually going to negotiate with them.
Yeah. Very helpful, I'm sure, to many parents of any age children, to be honest.
Yeah.
Glyn, I'm conscious of our time, and thank you so much. One last question, and then let's talk about how people get in touch with you. Do you negotiate on everything?
No. No. As I said,
it's a nightmare to go shopping with, right?
Yeah, I negotiate a lot, but not everything.
Right.
I make that assessment early as to where there's value for me.
Right.
So, okay, you know, time, energy, planning, time, commitment. So, you know, for low value things, if it's an easy one, I'll give it a good shot at getting what I want.
Right.
If it feels like the time, energy, and the resource required to do it is not enough for the trade-off, I won't. You know, and simple examples like, you know, deciding on a movie, you know, with your partner can be a negotiation. And sometimes it's okay to be the accommodator and go, you know what, like, I'm not going to negotiate what movie I want to watch, even if it's not what I want to watch. I'll watch what you want to watch, because the trade-off for our relationship is worth more to me than
that's
spending 2 hours watching what I want to watch just so that I can be happy.
I read recently, which I thought was a nice way to sum it up: there are no perfect solutions, there are only imperfect trade-offs.
Yeah, I like that.
Lovely way to say it. So, Glyn, thank you for some real practical, helpful tips, tools, processes. If someone's interested in working with you, how do they get hold of you?
LinkedIn is a great way to reach me. So Glin Bayley on LinkedIn. And then on my website, thevaluenegotiator.com.
Great. So for LinkedIn, that's GLIN BAYLEY, Glin Bayley, and thevaluenegotiator.com.
Correct.
All lowercase?
All lowercase.
Great, fantastic. We'll put this in the show notes so people are interested. And I'm sure anyone who's negotiating a salary or dealing with teenage kids wants to pause at that point and kind of go, right, just rewind that. Tell me what those steps are again.
I've got a salary negotiation course as well. So
well, there you go. Perfect.
So someone can do that on self-service and in 2 hours learn exactly what they need.
It would probably pay for the salary increase.
Oh, without a doubt. It's priced so that it becomes a no-brainer. Like, my intention is to create more value. So, you know, I think at a very minimum, you could easily get 5 times what you've paid for the course itself.
Perfect. Glyn, thank you so much for what you revealed and your insight and expertise. Appreciate it.
Most welcome. Thank you very much.